Look at this document. June 2nd, 1924. It says Native Americans were granted citizenship. Granted. Like it was a gift from the government, but they'd been here for 15,000 years. They named these rivers. They mapped these mountains. They built democracies before Europe knew what the word meant. So how does the first become the last? How do the original people of a land end up needing permission to belong to it? So much darker than expected. Let's go back, way back, to 1491, 1 year before Columbus. North America wasn't empty. It wasn't wilderness waiting to be discovered. There were between 5 and 15 million people living here. The Haudenosaunee had a functioning democracy, with checks and balances. The ancestral Puebloans built cities in the cliffs of Mesa Verde. The Mississippian culture at Cahokia had a population bigger than London. These weren't scattered tribes wandering around. These were sophisticated civilizations, with trade networks stretching from coast to coast, with agriculture, with government systems, with astronomy, with medicine. And then the ships arrived. The biggest killer of Native Americans wasn't bullets. It wasn't cavalry charges. It wasn't even Andrew Jackson's forced marches. It was disease, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, diseases that Europeans had built immunity to over centuries. Native Americans had no biological defense. None. When Hernán de Soto marched through the southeast in 1540, he described densely populated towns. When French explorers came through the same area 150 years later, they found ghost towns. Entire societies had collapsed. Historians estimate that within 100 years of European contact, 90% of the native population was dead. 90%. Imagine 9 out of every 10 people you know just gone. This wasn't an accident. By the 1700s, British officers were deliberately giving smallpox-infected blankets to native tribes. There are letters, documented orders, biological warfare before the term even existed. One of the most documented cases happened during Pontiac's War in 1763. British officers at Fort Pitt explicitly discussed using smallpox as a weapon. They wrote about it, they planned it, they executed it. The land didn't become empty, naturally, it was emptied. And the people who survived were left to navigate a world where their population had been decimated, their trade networks destroyed, their cities abandoned. Now here's where it gets legally insane. When the United States formed in 1776, the founders had a problem. There were still millions of Native Americans living on land they wanted. So they created a legal fiction. They called tribes domestic dependent nations, not foreign countries, not US states, something in between. This comes from an 1831 Supreme Court case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. What this meant in practice was brutal. The US government could sign treaties with tribes like they were sovereign nations, but then break those treaties whenever they wanted. Because tribes weren't really sovereign. They were wards of the state, children who needed guidance. That's literally how Chief Justice John Marshall described them. Over 400 treaties were signed between the US and native nations. The United States violated every single one. Let me say that again. Every single one. The most famous violation was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Even though the Cherokee Nation had adopted a constitution, built schools, published newspapers in their own language, Andrew Jackson forced them out. The Trail of Tears. 16,000 Cherokee people forced to march 1 miles in winter. 4,000 died on the way. And this wasn't just the Cherokee. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, all forcibly removed. All to make room for white settlers and cotton plantations. But the removals didn't stop in the 1830s. Throughout the 1800s, Native Americans were continuously pushed onto smaller and smaller pieces of land. The reservation system wasn't designed to protect Native people. It was designed to concentrate them into areas that white settlers didn't want yet. And when those lands turned out to have value, gold in the Black Hills, oil in Oklahoma, the government found ways to take those too. After all of this, after the genocide, the forced removals, the stolen land. Native Americans still weren't considered citizens. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision said black people couldn't be citizens, but the 14th Amendment in 1868 fixed that. It said anyone born in the United States was automatically a citizen, except Native Americans. The government carved out a specific exception. Because they were members of tribal nations, they didn't count. In 1884, a man named John Elk tried to register to vote in Omaha. He was Winnebago, born on tribal land. The Supreme Court said, no, you're not a citizen. You can't vote. He was standing inside U.S. borders, but he wasn't American. Think about the timeline here. Chinese immigrants, banned from citizenship in 1882, got it back in 1943. Native Americans got citizenship in 1924. They were the last group to receive it. The people who were here first had to wait the longest. And the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, it wasn't about justice. It was about control. By 1924, the native population had dropped to about 250,000. Reservations were shrinking. The government had already taken most of what they wanted. Giving citizenship now wasn't a risk anymore. Plus, there was a catch. Citizenship came with strings. It was part of a larger assimilation policy. The goal was to erase Native identity completely. Before 1924, there was the Dawes Act of 1887. It broke up tribal lands into individual plots. The idea was to force Native Americans to become farmers, to abandon communal living, to become civilized. Millions of acres were lost. Land that couldn't be divided or sold under tribal law was suddenly on the market. And guess who bought it? White settlers. Between 1887 and 1934, Native Americans lost 2/3 of their land base. 90 million acres, gone, sold off to settlers, speculators, railroad companies. The Dawes Act was called allotment, but it was really just legalized theft. Then there were the boarding schools. From the 1870s to the 1960s, Native children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to schools designed to kill the Indian, save the man. That's a real quote from the founder of the Carlisle Indian School, Richard Henry Pratt. He said it proudly. They cut their hair, banned their languages, punished them for practicing their culture. Thousands died from disease and abuse in these schools. There are mass graves at former boarding school sites that we're only now beginning to excavate and acknowledge. Children as young as 5 were taken hundreds of miles from home and forbidden from seeing their families for years. If they practiced their religion, they were punished. The goal was cultural extinction. So when the government granted citizenship in 1924, it was the final step in trying to erase Native nations entirely. You're American now. Not Cherokee, not Lakota, not Dine. Just American. Assimilate or disappear. Some tribes rejected it. The Onondaga Nation, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, said, "We don't want your citizenship. We're not Americans. We're Onondaga." To this day, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy issues its own passports. They've used them to travel internationally since 1923. Some countries recognize them. The Haudenosaunee lacrosse team has traveled the world on these passports. In 2010, they nearly missed the World Lacrosse Championship because the US and UK wouldn't recognize their documents. They refused to travel on US passports, because doing so would mean surrendering their sovereignty. Because here's the truth that the 1924 law tried to obscure. These nations never surrendered. Not fully, not legally. The treaties might have been violated, but they're still legally binding. The Navajo Nation is 27,000 square miles, larger than 10 US states. The Lakota never ceded the Black Hills. A federal court confirmed that in 1980 and offered money as compensation. The Lakota refused. They don't want money, they want their land back. To this day, that money sits in a bank account, accumulating interest, now worth over $1 billion. The Lakota won't touch it, because accepting it would mean accepting that the land was legitimately taken. So the question isn't, why aren't Native Americans considered real Americans? The real question is, why would they want to be? American is a 250-year-old legal category created by colonizers to define who gets power and who doesn't. But the Dean, the Lakota, the Anishinaabe, the Lumbee, the Tlingit, These identities are thousands of years old. They survived a 90% population collapse. They survived forced removal. They survived cultural genocide. And they're still here, still fighting for their water rights, still protecting their sacred sites, still teaching their languages to new generations, despite a century of government policy designed to erase those languages forever. Today, there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, 327 reservations, over 5 million people who identify as Native American. They're not asking for permission, they're asserting sovereignty. That piece of paper from 1924 didn't make them American. It tried to erase the fact that they were something older, something that existed long before America did. They were the first people here. They named this land, and despite everything, every disease, every broken treaty, every boarding school, every forced march, they're still here. They didn't need to become American. America happened on their land,